Welcome to Sound Bites, hosted by registered dietitian nutritionist Melissa Joy Dobbins. Let's delve into the science, the psychology, and the strategies behind good food and nutrition.
Hello and welcome back to the Sound Bites podcast. Today's episode is about processed food and what you may not know, but what you should know about it. The term processed food is one of those buzzwords we often hear, but what does it really mean? Is it bad? Should we avoid processed foods? Should we be concerned about long ingredients lists? Are there any benefits to processing that we should know? We're going to tackle these questions that are on everyone's mind and discuss the science and insights on this trending topic. This episode is sponsored by PepsiCo, specifically their Health and Nutrition Sciences team, and we thank them for their sponsorship and support of the podcast. I have wanted to talk about processed foods on the podcast for a very long time, and I'm right around 200 episodes, so I'm glad we're finally talking about processed foods. I have two expert guests today, Dr. Tahnia Gonzalez and Dr. Bruce Hamaker. Dr. Tahnia Gonzalez is an associate principal scientist in the Health and Nutrition Sciences team at PepsiCo, and Dr. Hamaker is a distinguished professor of food science at Purdue University and director of the Whistler Center for Carbohydrate Research. Before we jump into the topic today, I would love for each of you to please share a little bit more about your backgrounds and the work that you currently do, especially as it relates to processed foods. Oh, and please share any disclosures you have as well. Dr. Hamaker, should I call you Dr. Hamaker or Bruce?
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. Please call me Bruce.
Okay, let's start with you then.
Thanks. I'm happy to be with you here today. First of all, my education background goes across a spectrum of biology, nutrition, and specifically nutritional biochemistry and food science, and more specifically food chemistry. I did do a postdoc also in a human metabolic laboratory, actually in Lima, Peru. And a lot of our work kind of goes into that area where food meets the body, and that's in the gastrointestinal tract. So in my laboratory, we do a lot of work towards how foods, and specifically carbohydrates, can be made to improve nutrition and health. And we also work in the area of processed foods in some of our projects. And perhaps just give you a couple of examples, like incorporating dietary fibers into extruded products. Like, how do you get dietary fibers in at a high amount, say 25% of total dietary fiber, while retaining quality? We've worked on starch. You know, carbohydrates have kind of a bad connotation, but we found if you digest starch in the right location of the small intestine, you can signal the gut-brain axis and actually make animals, anyway, lose weight or manage weight. And then also recently in using processing techniques to even improve the value of, say, insoluble fiber. I do have some disclosures. We have projects funded by industry, government, foundations, associations, and our industry-sponsored studies are generally of a basic knowledge-building type, like the couple I gave above in the fiber value area, and not really towards products per se. The Whistler Center of Carbohydrate Research, which I'm director, as was mentioned, is an industry member-based center here at Purdue, and members pay an annual fee, and we provide education, fundamental research, and analytical services to them. PepsiCo is a member of the Whistler Center. Though I don't have any current research funding from them, I have worked with them in the past. I also have a small startup company in the area of carbohydrates and gut health, but I think it's not so relevant here.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting. And Dr. Tahnia Gonzalez, should I call you Dr. Gonzalez or Tahnia?
Yes, Tahnia is okay, Melissa.
Thank you. Would you please share some about your background and work?
Yes, well, thank you so much for running this podcast. So I have a bachelor's degree in food industry engineering and a master's degree in biotechnology from Tec de Monterrey. I also earned my PhD in biochemistry at the University of Minnesota, where my research focused on metagenomics and characterizing enzymes that break down complex carbohydrates including some considered dietary fibers. I've been working in the food industry for 8 years, and prior to working for PepsiCo, I worked for General Mills and also H-E-B grocery retail. In my current role at PepsiCo, I conduct nutrition research related to the impact of processing on nutrient retention. I also conduct research in the area of nutrient profiling and foundational research on the health benefits of oats.
Okay, very interesting. And it's my understanding that both of you are very familiar with each other and have worked together in the past.
Yes, we have.
Excellent. So, Tahnia, you mentioned your degree is in food industry engineering. That sounds really interesting. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I think as an undergraduate student, I was very passionate about trying to understand how food was made. And during my bachelor's degree, I basically learned about all the different processes that the food industry uses to produce many different products, such as dairy, cereals, fruits and vegetables. So learning all the principles and engineering principles that are used today in the food industry to produce safe products.
Thank you. I did not know that that was a degree. It sounds really interesting. Okay, so let's jump into our processed foods conversation. When I think of processed foods, I think of something in a box, like cereal, or a can, like beans, vegetables, tuna, or frozen, like vegetables. But of course, there are other foods. So let's start with the definition of processed foods. Maybe Bruce can enlighten us. Is there a specific definition? And what about the term packaged food? Is that synonymous with processed?
Yeah, good question. So basically, processed food means any process that's used to convert raw foods or what we call agricultural commodities into foods that are safe, like Tahnia said, acceptable, and readily available to eat, like in grocery stores. There's different degrees of processing, obviously. There's minimally processed foods like flours you buy for home cooking to convenience processed foods that have different ingredients added. The U.S. Department of Agriculture defines processed food as any raw agricultural commodity that has been subject to washing, cleaning, milling, cutting, chopping, heating, even those kind of basic processes, to more advanced ones like pasteurizing, canning, freezing, drying, dehydrating, mixing. There's a number out there, right? And including even packaging, and also adding other kinds of ingredients like preservatives, flavors, even other nutrients, could be food additives also that can improve the quality of the product, make them more stable, keep them safe. You mentioned, Melissa, packaged food. I think you're right that a lot of people think of packaged food as processed food and sort of synonymously. Though, again, there's a wide range, right, as I mentioned, from minimally processed to more highly processed foods.
Thank you. So that makes me want to know then, and of course, you mentioned a whole laundry list of different types of processing. So let's talk a little bit more about the different kinds of processing we use today. I mean, I know as a registered dietitian, I'm a food safety enthusiast, and I'm a former supermarket dietitian. So I know that there are many reasons for processing, and there are benefits of different types of processing. But can you enlighten us a little bit about these reasons and benefits of some of the different types of processing?
Sure. Like old processes, right, that have been around for a long time, like canning, that was really kind of obvious, isn't it? That was done to store foods and to make them safe. And a way of making them safe is to thermally treat them, right? And then in the canned state, they can be stored for a long time. Freezing is like that also. Of course, there are other kinds of processes like fermentation that maybe people don't really think of in terms of processing, but of course, beer is one, right? But there's non-alcoholic fermentations too. There's a variety of fermented foods and sort of an increased area of interest, related to gut health, the gut microbiome and all. There's other processes to make convenience foods like extrusion cooking, and then also like spray drying, like say powdered milk, but spray drying is used for different reasons. I think at its sort of the basic level, processing was used and still is to make, raw foods more edible and for broad consumption and through markets. On a local or global scale, also food processing can be thought of as a way to reduce food waste and loss through preservation and improve shelf stability. It's important even in impoverished regions of the world to improve food security and reduce environmental impact of agriculture. In fact, I've been working for years in West and East Africa, and we use food processing there also. The last thing is that processing can also improve the nutritional quality through fortification. A lot of people know that, and maybe you don't think of that so much in terms of processing, but it does occur through processing, right? And there's many enriched foods that are on the market that even the federal government has regulations around and standards around.
Like vitamin D in milk.
That's right. Vitamin D in milk, B vitamins in bread, enriched bread. And
those were born out of public health concerns.
That's right. They really came out around in the 1930s, that period of time related to the increased knowledge of what vitamins do and understanding that vitamins were taken out, of bread in the milling process. So adding back.
Okay, thank you. There's some really interesting examples that you're sharing. I think most people probably think about food safety, but maybe they don't. But the whole concept of making the foods more available at different times of the year, more edible, digestible, if you will, and the whole concept about how it can reduce food waste and food loss, I think is really interesting. And of course, food waste is a hot topic these days. And we know when we have a lot of food waste, I think people are starting to connect the dots that has a negative impact on the environment. It's not just a waste of money or a waste of nutrients, but it can impact the greenhouse gases through the landfills. And I agree. I think that most people don't think about the fortification of foods as being processed, but that's a very important aspect as well. Tahnia, I feel like this is a very broad and complex topic, just listening to Bruce talk about these different reasons and benefits. And I think that poses challenges when health professionals and dietitians in particular are trying to educate or communicate with patients and the public. It's not simple or simplified. And certainly we don't want to oversimplify things, but could you speak to this and or expand on the benefits of processed foods?
Yeah, sure. As Dr. Hamaker mentioned, some benefits of processing for the end consumer include increasing convenience and safety, along with extending the shelf life of food products. Processing can also improve the nutritional characteristics of foods when used to incorporate nutrients of concern, such as you mentioned, vitamin D in milk and fiber. But also when you use processing to incorporate food groups to encourage, such as fruits, vegetables, whole grains, among others. So processing, one of the most exciting areas that I'd like to think about is that processing can also make our raw materials more versatile. Due to processing today, we can find very innovative products using, for instance, pulses in applications such as pasta and snacks. It is also important to mention that sometimes processing have been shown to increase the release and bioavailability of nutrients and reduce the presence of anti-nutritional factors. So those are among some of the benefits that come to mind.
Excellent. And both of you had mentioned extending shelf life, which I think a lot of people think, oh, that's bad. Something shouldn't last forever. But the benefit of that is, again, reducing food waste and making foods available at different times of the year at reasonable prices, as Dr. Hamaker said. So if either one of you wanted to comment a little bit more about that, because again, I think this is like we are thinking, oh, extending the shelf life is good, but some people might not understand the benefit of that.
Yeah, I think a good example is frozen vegetables, which can reach lots of consumers. Vitamins are retained quite well in the freezing process, and they're pretty cheap, aren't they? A lot of times they're cheaper than fresh produce. So if you get to that price point, you can really get more people eating them.
Mm-hmm.
Not everything's like that, but I think that's a good example. In Africa, we've been working over the years to set up like incubation kind of centers to aid and support women in processing. And there's very simple things like mangoes, like fruits, the production's so high, but there's not a way to make them stable other than bringing processing into it. So that's a really good example of how to reduce, say, in mangoes. We have a project with Rockefeller Foundation in Kenya. It's a way to reduce waste, right? Or really food loss that would just, rot on the side of the road or something, can't sell them, and keep and retain that, for consumers to eat in Kenya and maybe elsewhere.
Right. And so the difference between food waste and food loss is the loss is before it gets to the consumer, right?
Yeah, you're right. Waste is at the consumer and loss is before.
Okay, so I suppose it would be important to talk about if there are any drawbacks to processed foods that we should know about. I mean, other than some of the myths that we hear, what is the real deal? Any real drawbacks that we need to know about?
Yeah, it's an important question. I would first say that we don't know everything about the relationship between processed foods and health. And we know a lot, and we know, as we've talked about, a number of benefits, but there's still some things out there I'd say that we need to know more about. And an example would be like that highly processed foods digest rapidly. And that may be fine. I mean, it's good for infants to get nutrients really quickly, but maybe for long-term consumption, maybe it's not the best. We really don't know exactly. Also, there's been a tendency to add sugar of different types and salt to processed foods, and dietary guidelines now recommend reducing them. And certainly there's a lot of activity around that. And it's going to take some time, but I think people will see that happening, and it'll change somewhat what people have come to expect from processed foods.
Okay, good point. Yeah. I remember, I believe this was when I was a supermarket dietitian, and maybe it was after, this was like in the early 2000s, that I was a supermarket dietitian, and companies were starting to cut back or reduce the amount of sodium in canned foods, whether it was like soups or pasta sauces or things like that. And they started making drastic changes and putting it on the label and everything. And consumers really did not like that. And I think now the approach is more, making subtle changes and maybe not putting that out in neon lights. And we do know that our palate can change over time with regard to our preference for salt or sugar, and our taste buds can change to where we adapt to lower amounts. So I think that's helpful. Now you mentioned the word highly processed foods, and I think that can be confusing for people as well. Could you speak to that?
Sure. I think it comes down to not making it a black and white issue. Highly processed foods can certainly deliver good nutrition, have all those other things we've talked about. I mentioned that sugar and salt have been added in some processed foods, but there's that effort to reduce those. But not all what somebody might say is a highly processed food have a lot of sugar or salt. So it's really not a black or white issue. And I personally reject that idea of, this is a heavily processed food, I won't eat it. I look at the nutrition fact panel. Of course, I'm a food scientist, but I also know something about the food, and I pick accordingly. But I think maybe a little bit more attention to the nutrition fact panel, because there's a lot of highly or more heavily processed foods that have really good nutrition. So it's not a black and white issue.
Okay. Tahnia, could you provide us any insight on what registered dietitians generally think about processed foods?
Sure. The results of a recent survey with registered dietitians has indicated that while they believe processed foods can provide certain benefits such as convenience, accessibility, and affordability, there is concern over how processing may impact nutritional quality. There is also confusion amongst their clients on the actual meaning of processing. So overall, there seems to be an opportunity to provide clarity on what is the role of processing in our food supply.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense. And if dietitians in general can appreciate the benefits, but maybe not know exactly how to convey that to patients or clients, do we know how consumers who might also be our clients are viewing processed foods?
Well, IFIC, International Food Information Council, has published a consumer survey not very long ago. And what they found is that although consumers have some level of concern about various processed foods, around 75% of consumers purchase processed foods or beverages at least some of the time. And consumers are more likely to purchase these products if the items were high in protein or were fortified with vitamins and minerals. Other attributes that might motivate consumers to purchase processed foods or beverages include the taste and the price.
Right. So then in that vein, Tahnia, do you have some advice or insights on how dietitians can educate or communicate with consumers, clients, the public about this topic?
Yeah. So the first is to familiarize consumers with the role of processing in our food supply. Let's take the example of grains and legumes. These foods are not edible for human consumption, or not very edible, I would say, unless they're subjected to some amount of processing. Processing of grains with high temperatures allows starch to become digestible and function as a source of energy for the body, which in some cases we needed. For instance, the example of legumes, the process of cooking enhances the digestibility of starch and proteins and reduces the content of anti-nutritional factors.
Mm-hmm.
The second is to increase awareness on how some processed foods may be contributing to the diet. Analysis of enhanced data from 2003 to 2006 showed that consumption of processed fruits and vegetables have a significant contribution to the overall intakes of vitamin E and C, potassium, and dietary fiber in the American diet. So I think those are important points. So look at what is the contribution of these foods into the overall diet.
Yes, and then that's something that I say all the time on the podcast and all the time when I'm speaking to groups is we know we need more fruits and vegetables. We know we need those nutrients, and they don't have to be fresh. You can get frozen, canned, juices, dried, and still get all of those nutrients. I mean, with some exception. If it's a juice, you're not going to get as much fiber, but for the most part, they all count. All of those versions of fruits and vegetables count. So that's very important. Thank you for sharing that. Bruce, can you share a bit of the history of processed foods? Maybe that can help us understand how it came about and the role it plays.
Yeah, historically, food processing came about with urbanization and development of markets. So that was a long time ago, some hundreds of years ago. And as foods were sold away from farms and for off seasons, they needed to be preserved. There came about, as we talk, flour milling is like really old, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also canning and these kind of processes. Going all the way to convenience foods today, which is more of a modern thing, even some of those products are based on old processes. And I think many people are aware of like the sanitariums that rose up in southern Michigan, and then those big companies now, Kellogg's and Post, that's developed out of those. Those were cereal processes that were made to put them in a form that people would really like to eat, breakfast cereals, and retain their nutritional properties. Another example would be like corn masa and tortilla chips is a really old process that's used to make tortillas and tortilla chips.
Right. Now, I said at the top of the show that I haven't done an episode on processed foods. However, I did do an episode, it was number 17, and like I said, I'm around 200 right now, with a food historian named Rachel Loudon, and it was called A Historian's Take on Food and Food Politics. And she does give us a nice history of food processing and the Industrial Revolution, and talks about, you mentioned milling was a big movement and a big part of food processing. And in that episode, Rachel says, back then I would be a miller's daughter, but now I'm a dietitian. So it kind of, helped free people up from the food production chain and explore other careers, if you will. I also have some previous episodes talking about the difference between like whole grains and refined grains and indulgent grains. And I found it interesting that like when you look at staple grains like cereals, rice, and pasta, compared to indulgent grains like cakes and cookies, those are two very different categories of food, at least from a dietitian standpoint, but those are often lumped together in research studies. And I'll link to all of these related episodes in my show notes, of course, but it seems like perhaps there's like a false perception or association between processed and convenience foods. So Bruce, this makes me wonder, does processing strip nutrients from the food? Should we be concerned about like long ingredients lists?
Well, I think some processes certainly do remove some nutrients. Like I talked earlier, like cereal, you mentioned it right now. Cereal milling removes the bran layer, right? And it removes the germ, and you remove some vitamins and minerals. That's why there are standards to add those back. Thermal treatments also can lower vitamins like vitamin C, and pasteurization of fruit juices. But not all processing strips nutrients from food, and even some like fermentation actually adds nutrients back. Regarding long ingredients lists, I guess my view is that we have a strong regulatory system and ingredients go through very rigorous toxicological testing. But that said, I can personally understand why many people want less ingredients in their foods and processed foods. And you probably also know, and probably the audience does, that many processing companies are moving in this direction of reducing long ingredients lists. So even though I think it's not always related to health, or not really related to health, but I think that that's coming anyway. But also to say that some ingredients are really important for mundane reasons, it seems to us consumers. Something like a chemically modified carbohydrate that's necessary, say, in a plant-based protein burger to hold everything together. And it's tough to keep, that plant-based protein burger all in one piece without having some kind of cohesive agent. There has to be an ingredient in there. So, that's why a lot of these things are needed to be put into the processed food.
Yeah, that makes sense. So then what do you say to people who look for clean labels? I mean, you kind of mentioned this. My experience is that a short ingredients list doesn't equate to what I like to call nutrient-rich foods. So I tell people not to worry about long ingredients lists and words they can't pronounce. But what's your take on that?
Yeah, I'm in agreement with what you say. I think that the trend, as I said, is going the other way. But sometimes, you can't get, the outcome you need without adding ingredients. And also, as far as, hard to pronounce words and people don't know what they are, but a lot of times an ingredient has an unfamiliar word, but it's still natural, something like carrageenan. There was some controversy around carrageenan some years back. It's a seaweed polysaccharide or carbohydrate that's used to improve texture. So I think it necessitates kind of a closer look, but I'm in general agreement with what you say that long ingredients lists are not something to be fearful of. And also, just one last thing, that there are enrichments, nutritional enrichments, vitamins, sometimes either other agents that are added as ingredients. And those are important for health, and they sometimes have odd names like retinol palmitate is vitamin A. So there are things like that too.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. I couldn't agree more. And just as a fun fact side note, you brought up carrageenan. When I was in graduate school at Mizzou, University of Missouri, Columbia, in the early 90s, McDonald's came out with this, it's like, I can't remember what they called it. It was like the McLight or something. It was like a lighter burger. I don't think it was plant-based, but it was just lighter, and it had carrageenan in it. And interestingly, that was like my first ever media interview. I was interviewed by the newspaper about this, and I still have the clipping. So
Really?
Yeah, and of course, it was rejected by consumers, interestingly, but I'm glad to see it's still, it's seaweed. It still has a role in our food system. So interesting. So when I hear what you're saying, that the clean labels, or maybe I shouldn't use that term, but the shorter ingredients list is where you see things trending and moving in the future, it makes me wonder, is that because that's what consumers want, or that's what they think they want, or that's what the food industry thinks consumers want, versus is that really what is best for the food itself? I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Why have an ingredient that doesn't add to the functionality of the food or provide a nutritive benefit or some kind of clear benefit? I think many companies kind of reduce their ingredient list to accommodate, that kind of feeling. But then the ingredients that are there are essential. Most of those are quite essential to getting the kind of product that people really want to eat and deliver the right, nutrients and all of that. So I think that there is kind of a misconception going on out there. And I don't know what the answer is other than education. Mm-hmm. I think that consumer education probably is where it's at on that.
Okay, thank you. So as we're wrapping up, I would love to hear from both of you on a couple of questions. So for each of you, what do you think are the biggest misconceptions about processed food? Tahnia, we'll start with you.
I will say, I will echo what Dr. Hamaker has mentioned, that is black and white, right? That all the processes either are good or bad. And I think that is more about understanding what has been the role of processing throughout all these years. So I think not everything is good or bad. So I think I echo that.
Okay, great. And Bruce, what do you think the biggest misconception or misconceptions about processed food are?
To me, it's the same thing, that all processed food is bad. It's just not the reality. Mm-hmm. Processed food is part of the way we eat food, the way we access food and the way we eat food. I think one of the biggest opportunities we have in the area of public health is to improve processed food, make new processed food in the future that, even as a scientist, I can imagine processed food delivering some nutrients, perhaps even in a better way than in its natural state. Not that I'm against, I eat a lot of food, that we cook at home. It's not that. But I do think that there's an opportunity that people wouldn't see out there. And it's, there's some labeling systems in other parts of the world, that are being used that kind of rank processed foods. And I think it's really wrong-headed myself, because I think that it negates the possibility that there's a lot of things that can be done to processed foods to make them really, really healthy, and that already processed foods are quite healthy. And it's not just simply this one or the other kind of mentality.
Thank you. And then this might be somewhat similar, but if you had anything additional to add to this, what do you want people to know about processed food? What do you want the consumers to know? What do you want health professionals to know?
Yeah, for me, I would say that people really don't have to worry about processed foods. They need to look at the nutrition fact panel, pay attention to the U.S. dietary guidelines that went through lots of deliberations, and include all kinds of foods, including processed foods, and to make choices wisely and not avoid processed foods. It's part of getting foods to people, and it's part of our society.
Great. And Tahnia?
I think something that to me is really important for consumers to know is that when we say processing, we are referring to a lot of technologies that we use in the food manufacturing today, right? Mm-hmm. That enable innovation, that is enabled to overcome challenges that either the food supply today is facing or will face soon. It's enabling us to look at new substrates, to look at new products that we can create, or that the same way that we're thinking about new substrates is how will we extend, the supply of some other products even for longer times to avoid adding other ingredients. So there are many opportunities, and processed foods offer the possibility of applying more innovative ways to produce food, to develop new foods, to allow people to experience things that they might not have the opportunity to do so otherwise. So that's why I'm supportive of processing and the possibilities that offer us.
Excellent. Very interesting. Thank you. Well, I want everybody to know as we're wrapping up that there's a handout, a resource, if you will, that I will link to in the show notes for more information for consumers and also for health professionals to use with patients and clients to help communicate the benefits and the role of processed foods in our food system and our diet. And also, there was a webinar on December 14th that builds on this conversation and increases our knowledge of how foods are processed, explores existing and new processing technologies and their benefits, and demonstrates how dietitians can communicate about processing and processed foods with patients and clients. You can find more information and resources. I will link to all of this in my show notes at soundbitesrd.com. And I just want to thank both of you so much. One of the favorite things about doing my podcast is meeting new and interesting people just like both of you. It has been a true pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Melissa. Enjoyed it.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you for the invitation.
And for everybody listening, as always, enjoy your food with health in mind. And of course, enjoy your processed food with health in mind. Till next time.
For more information, visit soundbitesrd.com. Music by Dave Burke, produced by Jag in Detroit Podcasts.